Frank Thompson dropped his coffee mug, the ceramic shattering against the porch steps as he watched his German shepherd collapse beside the hole. Ranger had been digging for 4 straight days, refusing food, water, sleep, everything that kept him alive. And now the old war dog was dying in the Montana dirt. The hole wasn't random. It was precise, methodical, desperate. Margaret Chen's scream pierced the morning air from across the fence line. She'd seen something Frank hadn't, something metallic glinting in the dark earth where Ranger's claws had torn away 51 years of silence. Frank's hands trembled as he knelt beside his dying companion, the dog who'd saved his life in Afghanistan now gasping for breath. This wasn't normal behavior. This was a mission Ranger would die completing. "Call the vet. Now!" But even as the words left his mouth, Frank knew this went deeper than veterinary medicine. What had Ranger found buried beneath their family ranch? And why was his father's war buddy's dog tag gleaming in that hole? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Frank Thompson had built his life on 2 unshakable foundations: his father's war hero legacy and Ranger's unwavering loyalty. At 68, with 3 years of widowerhood weighing heavy on his shoulders, these were the only truths that still held meaning on the 500-acre Montana ranch that had been home for over 4 decades. The ranch stretched across rolling hills 30 miles east of Bozeman, where the wind carried the scent of pine and cattle, and the nearest neighbor lived far enough away that a man could grieve in private. Frank had inherited the property when his father Robert passed in 2015, along with a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and stories of heroism in the jungles of Vietnam that had shaped Frank's own decision to serve in Afghanistan decades later. Sarah's death 3 years ago had left Frank with medical bills that gnawed at the ranch's finances like termites in old wood. Cancer treatment cost more than cattle could earn, and the VA disability checks barely covered the mortgage payments Robert had taken out for improvements. Frank never understood. The house felt too big, too quiet, too full of memories that hurt to touch. Ranger was all Frank had left of his old life. The 9-year-old German shepherd had been his partner in Afghanistan, a military working dog trained to detect explosives and save lives. They'd retired together after an IED nearly killed them both in Kandahar, 2 broken soldiers trying to heal on Montana soil. Ranger's PTSD mirrored Frank's own. Sudden sounds triggered alert postures, nightmares caused midnight pacing, and crowds made them both nervous. But here on the ranch, they'd found peace together. Until 4 days ago, when something changed. Ranger had always been methodical, intelligent, purposeful in every action. Military training didn't fade easily. But this digging behavior was different. Obsessive, desperate, urgent in a way that reminded Frank uncomfortably of the dog's bomb detection work. The same focused intensity, the same refusal to be distracted, the same unwillingness to abandon a mission until completion. The hole sat in the northeast corner of the property, near the massive oak tree Robert had planted when he'd first bought the land in 1974. Frank had asked his father about that tree once. Why plant it so far from the house, away from everything else? Robert had grown quiet, stared at the sapling for a long time, then said simply, "Some things need to stand alone." Now Ranger was destroying himself trying to reach something buried beneath that tree's roots. The dog had worn his paws raw, lost 15 pounds, and developed a tremor in his hind legs that Dr. Patricia Miller at the veterinary clinic couldn't explain. She'd prescribed anxiety medication, suggested stress-related disorders, recommended behavioral therapy. Nothing worked. Margaret Chen, the nearest neighbor, had noticed the change too. Her property bordered Frank's along the eastern fence line, and she'd called twice to ask if everything was all right. "That dog's got the same look my late husband had when he came back from Korea," she'd said, "like he's fighting a war nobody else can see." The breaking point came on the fourth morning when Frank found Ranger unconscious beside the hole, his breathing shallow and labored. The dog's massive frame, once powerful enough to tackle insurgents in Afghan mountains, now looked frail against the Montana earth he'd been clawing at with desperate determination. Frank knelt beside his partner, running weathered hands through Ranger's thick coat. The dog's temperature was dangerously low, his gums pale, his pulse weak but steady. This wasn't just exhaustion. This was a creature dying from the inside out, consumed by a mission Frank couldn't understand. "What is it, boy?" Frank whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of impending loss. "What's down there that's worth dying for?" Ranger's eyes fluttered open, fixing on Frank with an intensity that cut through the morning fog. The same look he'd given during their last patrol in Kandahar, when the German Shepherd had suddenly stopped dead in the middle of a busy marketplace, every muscle in his body rigid with warning. Frank had learned to trust that look absolutely. It had saved their entire squad from an IED buried beneath a fruit vendor's cart. The hole was deeper than Frank had realized, 4 feet across and nearly 3 feet down, carved with the precision of military engineering. Ranger hadn't been digging randomly. He'd been excavating methodically, removing dirt in careful layers, working around roots with surgical patience. The walls were smooth, the corners squared, the bottom packed hard from constant trampling. Frank studied the excavation site with the tactical awareness that had kept him alive through 2 deployments. This wasn't animal behavior. This was a search and recovery operation. Margaret Chen appeared at the fence line, her silver hair catching the early light as she climbed through the wooden rails with surprising agility for a woman in her 70s. She'd been Frank's only real neighbor since Sarah's death, bringing casseroles during the worst of his grief, checking on him during the brutal Montana winters when the isolation could break a man's spirit. "How's he doing?" she asked softly, approaching Ranger with the careful respect one soldier showed another. "Dying," Frank said simply. "Dr. Miller says his heart can't take much more of this stress. She wants to sedate him, force him to rest, but every time the medication wears off, he's right back here." Margaret knelt beside the hole, her sharp eyes scanning the disturbed earth. "My husband came back from Korea with the same look Ranger's got." Like he was searching for something he'd lost over there, something that wouldn't let him rest until he found it. Frank had heard stories about Margaret's late husband, a Marine who died in a car accident 20 years ago, but she rarely talked about the war years. Now she studied the excavation with an expression Frank recognized, the haunted awareness of someone who'd lived with a soldier's unfinished business. "What if he's not sick?" Margaret said quietly. "What if he's trying to tell you something?" The idea hit Frank like a physical blow. In Afghanistan, Ranger's obsessive behavior had always meant one thing: hidden danger that needed immediate attention. IEDs, weapons caches, enemy positions. The dog had an uncanny ability to detect threats that human senses missed entirely. Military handlers learned to read their partner's signals like scripture, trusting canine instincts over their own judgment. Frank pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, stopping at Dr. Miller's number. The veterinarian had been kind but dismissive of any explanation beyond stress-related illness. She'd recommended behavioral modification, anti-anxiety drugs, even suggested putting Ranger down if his suffering became unbearable. "What if I told you to trust him?" Frank asked himself, staring down at the hole that had consumed his partner's final reserves of strength. The decision crystallized with military clarity. Frank had spent 8 years in the Army learning to trust his fellow soldiers' instincts, even when orders or common sense suggested otherwise. Ranger had earned that trust in blood and sand, saving lives with his nose, his courage, his absolute dedication to the mission. "I'm going to help him dig," Frank announced, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. Margaret nodded as if she'd been waiting for this decision. "I'll get some proper tools from my shed. If Ranger thinks something's down there, we're going to find out what it is." Frank watched his neighbor walk back toward her property with purposeful strides, then looked down at Ranger. The dog's breathing had steadied, his eyes more alert, as if he understood help was finally coming. "All right, partner," Frank said, the old military familiarity returning to his voice. "One more mission, but this time we do it together." Ranger's tail thumped weakly against the ground, the first sign of hope Frank had seen in 4 days. Margaret returned with a collection of tools that spoke to decades of ranch work. A short-handled spade, a soil probe, even an old military entrenching tool that looked suspiciously familiar. Frank recognized the weathered green metal immediately, standard-issue equipment that every soldier learned to trust. "My husband's," Margaret explained simply, handing Frank the entrenching tool. "Figure it's time it got back to work." Frank hefted the familiar weight, muscle memory flooding back from countless hours of digging foxholes and clearing debris in Afghanistan. Ranger watched from a safe distance, his breathing steadier now that reinforcements had arrived. The dog's eyes tracked every movement as Frank positioned himself at the edge of the hole. The first shovelful of dirt revealed nothing unusual, just the dark Montana soil that had fed cattle and crops for 50 years. But as Frank worked deeper, following Ranger's original excavation pattern, the earth began to feel different. Looser, less compacted than the surrounding ground, as if this section had been disturbed before. 3 feet down, the spade struck something that wasn't rock or root, something that gave under pressure, then pushed back with an unmistakably artificial resistance. "Margaret," Frank called softly, his voice tight with sudden tension. "Come look at this." She knelt beside the hole as Frank carefully brushed away loose soil from around the obstruction. A corner of olive drab fabric emerged from the earth, the military green instantly recognizable to anyone who'd served. The material was faded but intact, protected by the clay-rich soil from complete decay. Frank's hands trembled as he cleared more dirt away. This wasn't just any fabric. It was military issue, the same durable canvas used for field uniforms during the Vietnam era. The same material his father would have worn during his tours in Southeast Asia. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered, her face draining of color. "Frank, what is this?" Ranger had moved closer to the excavation, his nose working the air currents rising from the disturbed earth. The dog's behavior had shifted from frantic digging to careful observation, as if his mission was entering a new phase. He wasn't agitated anymore. He was focused, alert, ready. Frank continued excavating with archaeological precision, removing soil grain by grain around the fabric. More material appeared. A leather belt, the brass buckle green with age, and something that made Frank's breath catch in his throat. Metal tags on a chain, corroded but still legible. With shaking fingers, Frank lifted the dog tags from their 50-year resting place. The stamped letters were clear enough to read in the afternoon light. SGT Michael Torres, B. Nagy, Catholic, 1952. The name hit Frank like a physical blow. Michael Torres. He'd heard that name countless times growing up, always spoken with a mixture of pride and sadness in his father's voice. Robert Thompson's best friend from Vietnam, the soldier who'd died in combat defending a village near Da Nang, the hero whose body had never been recovered from the jungle. Except, Michael Torres wasn't lost in a Vietnamese jungle. He was buried in Frank's backyard. "I know this name," Frank said slowly, his mind racing through decades of family stories. "My father talked about him. Said he was the bravest man he'd ever known. Said he died saving civilians during a firefight." Margaret took the dog tags with reverent hands, studying the corroded metal. If he died in Vietnam, What's he doing buried on your ranch?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, acrid and choking. Frank stared down at the partial remains emerging from the Montana soil, trying to reconcile the stories he'd grown up with against the physical evidence at his feet. Ranger moved to Frank's side, pressing his warm bulk against his master's leg. The gesture was pure comfort, the same way the dog had steadied Frank during panic attacks in the months after their return from Afghanistan. Animals understood trauma in ways humans couldn't articulate, and Ranger seemed to sense that this discovery was about to shatter something fundamental in Frank's world. "There has to be an explanation," Frank said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe Dad brought the body home for burial. Maybe the family wanted him interred here instead of Arlington." Margaret's expression was gentle but skeptical. "Then why no headstone? Why no funeral? Why bury a war hero in an unmarked grave in the middle of nowhere?" The questions multiplied like fractures in glass, each one weakening the foundation of everything Frank thought he knew about his father. Robert Thompson had been Frank's hero long before he'd ever worn a uniform himself. The stories of courage under fire, of brotherhood forged in combat, of sacrifices made for fellow soldiers, these had shaped Frank's entire understanding of honor and duty. But heroes didn't bury their best friends in secret graves. Frank looked around the ranch with new eyes, seeing the property his father had purchased in 1974 with money that had always seemed mysteriously abundant for a returning veteran. The improvements Robert had made over the years, the additions to the house, the expansion of the cattle operation, all funded by sources Frank had never questioned. "We need to keep digging," Frank said finally, his voice hollow with dawning dread. "If Michael Torres is buried here, we need to know why, and we need to know what else is down there." Ranger's tail wagged once, a subtle signal of approval. The mission was far from over, and the old German shepherd seemed to understand that the most important discoveries still lay ahead. By nightfall they had uncovered what remained of Sergeant Michael Torres. The skeleton lay on its side in what Frank recognized as a defensive position, knees drawn up, arms crossed over the chest, as if the man had been trying to protect himself in his final moments. This wasn't the peaceful burial of a war hero. This was the hasty concealment of a murder victim. Margaret had gone home hours ago, shaken by the discovery and promising to return the next morning with coffee and a clearer head. Frank sat alone beside the grave. Ranger pressed against his side, both of them keeping vigil over a man who'd been denied proper rest for 51 years. The dog tags weren't the only artifacts they'd found. A wallet, leather cracked but contents preserved, contained a driver's license from Colorado dated 1973, a faded photograph of a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes, and $17 in bills that crumbled at Frank's touch. There was also a wedding ring, simple gold band worn thin, and a letter folded so small it had survived 5 decades pressed against Torres's ribs. Frank had been afraid to open the letter in daylight with Margaret watching. Some discoveries demanded privacy, required the darkness that made terrible truths easier to bear. Now, with only Ranger as witness, he carefully unfolded the yellowed paper and began to read by flashlight. The handwriting was careful, precise, the words of a man who knew his time was running short. "If you're reading this, then Robert Thompson has killed me. I pray it's the authorities who find this letter and not my family. I've tried to do the right thing, but the cost has become too high. The things I saw in Vietnam, the things we did, I can't carry them anymore. But when I told Robert I was going to testify before Congress, he said there were other ways to handle the situation." I should have known what he meant. Frank's hands shook as he continued reading. The letter detailed war crimes that made his stomach turn: the massacre of civilians, the execution of prisoners, the systematic torture of suspected Viet Cong sympathizers. And through it all, Robert Thompson's name appeared again and again, not as a reluctant participant but as an enthusiastic leader. Robert says the war made us do terrible things, that we were just following orders. But I was there. I saw his face when he killed those children. He enjoyed it. And when I told him I couldn't live with the guilt anymore, he said I was weak, said I was betraying my brothers in arms. But there's a difference between loyalty and complicity. The letter went on to describe Torres's return to Colorado, his attempts to contact military investigators, his growing fear that Robert was monitoring his communications. The final paragraph was dated just days before Torres's disappearance. Robert called today, said he wanted to make things right, invited me to his new ranch in Montana. He said we could talk through everything, find a way to move forward that honored our service. I know it's a trap, but I have to try. Maybe there's still some of the man I served with left inside the monster he's become. If not, at least this letter will survive to tell the truth. Frank's vision blurred as he folded the letter and placed it carefully in his jacket pocket. The man he'd worshipped as a hero, the father whose approval he'd spent his entire life trying to earn, had been a war criminal and a murderer. Every story about Robert's courage had been a lie. Every medal he'd earned was tainted with innocent blood. Ranger whined softly, sensing his master's distress. The dog's warm presence was the only thing keeping Frank anchored to reality as his world collapsed around him. Everything he'd believed about honor, duty, and service, all of it built on a foundation of lies and murder. Frank pulled out his phone and stared at the screen, thumb hovering over the contacts. He should call the sheriff, report the discovery, let the law handle what came next. But the implications terrified him. Once this became official, there would be investigations, media attention, questions about how much Frank had known and when he'd known it. The ranch would become a crime scene, his father's reputation would be destroyed, and the military legacy Frank had spent his career building would crumble. More than that, there was Margaret to consider. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the ranch, an elderly woman was sleeping peacefully, unaware that her husband's murderer had lived just miles away for 40 years. How do you tell someone that their 50-year wait for answers has ended in the worst possible way? Frank's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "We know what you found. Don't do anything stupid. We'll be in touch." The words sent ice through Frank's veins. Someone had been watching, waiting, monitoring the situation, which meant this wasn't just about Robert Thompson's crimes. It was about people who were still alive, still invested in keeping the truth buried. Frank looked around the ranch with new paranoia. The darkness that had always felt protective now seemed threatening, full of hidden watchers and unseen dangers. Ranger's ears pricked forward, the dog's attention focused on something beyond Frank's perception. After years of partnership, Frank had learned to trust Ranger's senses absolutely. "What is it, boy?" Frank whispered. Ranger's low growl was barely audible, but Frank felt it through the dog's chest where they were pressed together. Something was moving in the darkness beyond the house, careful and deliberate, but not quite careful enough to fool a military working dog's trained senses. Frank reached for his father's old .45 pistol, the one Robert had carried in Vietnam and later kept in the kitchen drawer for protection. Now Frank wondered what his father had really been protecting, his family or his secrets. The weapon felt heavy in his hands, loaded with bullets that might have witnessed atrocities Frank was only beginning to understand, but it was the only defense he had against whatever was moving through the night toward them. Another text message lit up his phone screen. "You have something that belongs to us. We're coming to collect it." Frank's military training kicked in automatically. Assess the situation, identify the threat, protect what matters most. Ranger was still weak from his 4-day vigil, in no condition for a fight. The house offered better defensive positions than the open ground around the grave, and if these people were willing to kill to protect Robert Thompson's secrets, they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate witnesses. "Come on, Ranger," Frank whispered, helping the old dog to his feet. "Time to fall back and regroup." They moved toward the house with tactical precision, Frank's eyes scanning the darkness for movement, while Ranger's nose worked the wind for scents that didn't belong. The German Shepherd's military training was as ingrained as Frank's own. They were a team, watching each other's backs the way they had in Afghanistan. But as they reached the porch steps, Frank realized something that made his blood run cold. The people stalking them through the darkness knew about the grave, knew about Torres, knew enough to send threatening messages within hours of the discovery, which meant they'd been watching for much longer than just tonight. Frank's phone rang, the sound sharp and jarring in the Montana stillness. The caller ID showed another unknown number, but Frank answered anyway. "Mr. Thompson," a woman's voice said, cultured and calm despite the late hour. "My name is Senator Patricia Hartley. I believe you found something that belonged to my father, Colonel James Hartley. We need to talk." Frank gripped the phone tighter, his knuckles white against the plastic. Senator Patricia Hartley's voice carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. But underneath the political polish, he detected something else, desperation masked as control. "I don't know what you're talking about," Frank said carefully, though his eyes remained fixed on the darkness beyond his porch light. "Mr. Thompson, please don't insult my intelligence. My security team has been monitoring your property since your dog began his excavation project. We know exactly what you found, and we know you've read the letter. Now, we need to discuss how this situation can be resolved quietly and profitably for everyone involved." The word profitably hung in the air like a threat disguised as an opportunity. Frank could hear vehicles in the distance now, engines running low and steady, probably positioned at strategic points around his property. Professional surveillance, military precision, these weren't amateur players trying to contain a scandal. "Your father was Colonel James Hartley," Frank said, pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. "The commanding officer mentioned in Torres's letter. Among other things, yes. My father served his country with distinction for 30 years. One unfortunate incident during a difficult war shouldn't overshadow a lifetime of honorable service. I'm sure you understand, as a veteran yourself." Frank's grip tightened on his father's pistol. "Unfortunate incident. Your father ordered the execution of civilians, women and children, Senator. That's not an unfortunate incident. That's a war crime." Patricia's laugh was cold and brittle. "War crimes are what the winners call the losers' necessary actions, Mr. Thompson. History is written by those who survive to tell the story. Your father understood that principle. He chose to be a survivor rather than a victim of naive idealism. My father murdered his best friend to cover up what you people did. Your father protected his unit, his family, and his future from the destructive delusions of a man who couldn't handle the realities of combat. Michael Torres was going to destroy the lives of dozens of good soldiers over actions taken in the heat of battle against an enemy that used children as weapons and civilians as shields." Ranger's growl had grown more pronounced, his body tense against Frank's leg. The dog's military training was obvious in his posture, alert, ready, waiting for the command to engage. Frank could feel the German Shepherd's muscles coiled like springs, decades of conditioning ready to explode into action despite his weakened condition. "What do you want?" Frank asked bluntly. "I want to offer you a choice, Mr. Thompson. A choice between destroying the legacies of good men over something that happened 50 years ago, or accepting a generous settlement that allows everyone to move forward with dignity intact." Through the kitchen window, Frank caught a glimpse of movement near the barn. Dark figures, military precision in their positioning, surrounding the house with professional efficiency. These weren't political operatives. They were soldiers, or former soldiers, people who understood tactics and weren't afraid to use them. How generous, Frank found himself asking, hating himself for the question, but needing to understand the scope of what he was facing. $2.3 million for your ranch, Mr. Thompson. Enough to pay off your medical debts, relocate somewhere comfortable, start fresh. All we ask in return is your discretion regarding what you've found and your cooperation in ensuring it stays found. The amount was staggering, more money than Frank had ever imagined having. Enough to solve every financial problem, to ensure a comfortable retirement, to honor Sarah's memory without the constant stress of unpaid bills and mounting debt. Enough to get Ranger the best medical care available, to give the old dog a peaceful final chapter instead of the suffering he'd endured for the past 4 days. And if I refuse? Patricia's pause was telling. I hope it doesn't come to that, Mr. Thompson. You're a veteran, a man who understands the importance of unit cohesion and mission security. Sometimes protecting the greater good requires difficult sacrifices from individuals. Your father understood that principle. Frank closed his eyes, trying to process the impossible choice being forced upon him. Accept the money and become complicit in covering up murder and war crimes, or refuse and face consequences that Patricia wasn't spelling out but were clearly implied. I need time to think, Frank said finally. Of course. But understand that time is a limited commodity in this situation. Other parties are becoming aware of your discovery, parties who might not approach this matter with the same professionalism we're offering. Federal investigators, journalists, family members of other victims. Once this story becomes public, it takes on a life of its own. The mention of other victims made Frank's stomach lurch. Torres's letter had hinted at multiple incidents, systematic crimes rather than isolated atrocities. How many families had spent decades wondering what happened to sons, husbands, fathers who had simply vanished after threatening to expose the truth? How many others? Frank asked quietly. I'm not sure what you mean. How many other Michael Torreses? How many other families like mine, built on lies and blood money? Patricia's silence stretched long enough to answer the question. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern, a system, a conspiracy that had lasted for half a century and left bodies buried across multiple states. My security team will maintain their perimeter tonight, Mr. Thompson. For your protection, of course. We wouldn't want any accidents to occur while you're considering our offer. I'll call again tomorrow morning for your decision. The line went dead, leaving Frank alone with Ranger and the weight of an impossible choice. Through the windows he could see the subtle signs of professional surveillance, shadows that moved too purposefully, reflections that suggested optical equipment, the barely audible hum of electronic monitoring devices. Frank looked down at Ranger, whose brown eyes reflected the kitchen light with ancient wisdom. The dog had saved Frank's life in Afghanistan not through dramatic heroics but through simple, unwavering loyalty. When the IED exploded, Ranger had thrown himself between Frank and the blast, absorbing shrapnel that should have been fatal, but somehow walking away from wounds that would have killed a lesser animal. Now, Ranger had saved Frank again, leading him to a truth that others had killed to suppress. But this time, the consequences of that salvation were far more complex than battlefield medicine and Purple Hearts. Frank's phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret. Couldn't sleep. Saw vehicles on your property. Are you okay? The question was simple, but the answer was impossibly complicated. Frank was alive, physically unharmed, financially secure if he chose to be. But he wasn't okay, and wouldn't be okay until he figured out how to honor both his father's memory and Michael Torres's sacrifice without getting everyone he cared about killed in the process. He typed back, "Everything's fine. Talk tomorrow." But as Frank sent the message, he realized he'd just told Margaret the first lie in their 3-year friendship. Nothing was fine, and tomorrow would bring choices that would define not just his own future, but the legacy of everyone who had died to protect or expose the truth. Ranger pressed closer, offering comfort without judgment, loyalty without conditions. Whatever Frank decided, the old German shepherd would stand with him. Some bonds transcended moral complexity, political convenience, and even the fear of death itself. Frank didn't sleep. He sat in his father's old recliner with Ranger at his feet and Robert's .45 in his lap, watching shadows move beyond the windows as Patricia Hartley's security team maintained their vigil. Every creak of the old house, every shift of wind through the Montana pines sent adrenaline coursing through his system like he was back in Kandahar waiting for mortars to fall. By dawn, he'd made his decision. The call came at exactly 7 a.m., Patricia's voice crisp and professional despite the early hour. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. I trust you've had time to consider our conversation." "I have," Frank said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'll take your offer." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Frank wondered if the connection had dropped. When Patricia spoke again, her tone carried unmistakable relief. "I'm very pleased to hear that, Mr. Thompson. You've made the wise choice. My legal team will have the paperwork ready by this afternoon." A simple property sale, nothing complicated, nothing that would raise questions. "There are conditions," Frank said quickly before he could lose his nerve. "I'm listening. Michael Torres gets a proper burial, military honors, full ceremony, his name on a headstone. I don't care what story you tell about how his remains were recovered, but he doesn't stay in an unmarked grave." Another pause. "That can be arranged. The story will be that his remains were discovered during a routine archaeological survey, quite common when developing former military training areas. And I want to know about the others." This time the silence was longer, more dangerous. "Mr. Thompson, I think you're overreaching. How many other families are out there, Senator? How many other wives like Margaret Torres waiting for husbands who are never coming home because they're buried in unmarked graves on ranches bought with blood money? That information isn't part of our agreement." Frank's grip tightened on the phone. "Then there is no agreement. You want my silence? You give me something to stay silent about. All of it." The sound of Patricia consulting with someone else came through the phone, muffled voices discussing terms Frank couldn't quite make out. When she returned, her voice had hardened considerably. "6 others," she said finally, "spread across Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. All handled the same way, all buried on properties purchased by members of the unit. All families told their loved ones died heroically in combat." Frank closed his eyes, trying to process the scope of the cover-up. 7 families destroyed by lies. 7 good men murdered for threatening to expose war crimes. 7 graves hidden for 50 years to protect the careers and reputations of politicians and military officers. "The families deserve to know," Frank said. "The families deserve to remember their loved ones as heroes rather than victims," Patricia replied coldly. "Do you really want to tell some 80-year-old widow that her husband was executed by his own unit? Do you want to destroy the pride she's carried for 5 decades? The question hit Frank like a physical blow. Margaret Torres had survived 51 years believing her husband died serving his country with honor. Would learning the truth about his murder and the systematic cover-up that followed provide closure or destroy the faith that had sustained her through decades of grief? "What about justice?" Frank asked. "Justice for whom, Mr. Thompson?" "The perpetrators are all dead except for a handful of old men in their 80s and 90s. You want to put octogenarians on trial for crimes committed in the chaos of war half a century ago. You want to tear apart families, destroy careers, collapse political legacies over something that can't be undone." Frank found himself thinking about Sarah, about the last conversation they'd had before the cancer took her ability to speak. She'd made him promise to find peace after she was gone, to build something positive from their years together, rather than let grief consume what time he had left. "The money," Frank said finally. "Where does it come from?" "Private sources. People who understand the importance of protecting America's military reputation. Veterans organizations, defense contractors, patriotic citizens who believe our soldiers deserve better than to have their service questioned by people who weren't there." Frank realized he was being offered more than just money. He was being offered membership in a conspiracy that had lasted 50 years and showed no signs of ending. Join the cover-up, take the payment, become complicit in the very crimes that had started this nightmare. But the alternative was facing Patricia Hartley's security team with nothing but an old .45 and a sick dog for protection. "I need to make some calls first," Frank said. "Personal affairs to arrange before the sale." "Of course. But Mr. Thompson, I want to be very clear about something. This offer has an expiration date. Every hour you delay increases the risk that other parties become involved, parties who might not be as reasonable as we've been. I'm sure you understand." The threat was clear, even wrapped in diplomatic language. "Accept the deal quickly, or face consequences that wouldn't involve generous financial settlements and peaceful retirements." After ending the call, Frank sat in his father's chair and tried to reconcile the man he'd worshipped with the murderer described in Torres's letter. Robert Thompson had been Frank's moral compass for 68 years, the standard against which he'd measured every decision, every action, every choice. Learning that compass had always pointed toward corruption and violence left Frank feeling spiritually adrift. Ranger stirred at Frank's feet. The old dog's brown eyes focused on his master's face with concern that transcended species. The German Shepherd had given Frank unconditional loyalty for 9 years, asking nothing in return but food, shelter, and the chance to serve. Now, Ranger was offering comfort in the face of moral devastation, presence in the face of isolation, hope in the face of despair. Frank's phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "Coffee's ready if you want company." The message was simple, but Frank heard deeper meaning in the words. Margaret had lived through her own version of this nightmare for 51 years, carrying uncertainty and grief while maintaining faith that someday she'd learn the truth about her husband's fate. Now she was offering the same support to Frank that she'd probably wished someone had offered her during the worst of her own suffering. Frank looked around the house Robert had built with Michael Torres's blood money, at the improvements funded by conspiracy and murder, at the legacy of lies that had shaped his entire life. Patricia Hartley was right about one thing. The truth would destroy everything Frank had built his identity around. But as he watched Ranger struggle to his feet, still weak from his 4-day vigil, but determined to follow Frank wherever he went, Frank realized something important. Some forms of destruction cleared the ground for something better to grow. "Come on, boy," Frank said, helping Ranger toward the door. "Time to have coffee with a friend." Walking across the yard toward Margaret's house, Frank felt the weight of Patricia Hartley's surveillance team watching his every move. They were professionals, patient and disciplined, but they were also human. They had families, consciences, reasons for choosing the work they did. Some of them were probably veterans themselves, people who'd sworn oaths to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Frank wondered how many of them knew what they were really protecting, and how many had simply been told they were safeguarding national security from people who didn't understand the complexities of military service. By the time he reached Margaret's porch, Frank had made his final decision. Patricia Hartley had given him a choice between blood money and integrity, between comfortable lies and dangerous truth. But she'd made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed Frank Thompson was as corruptible as his father had been. As Margaret opened her door with a smile that reminded Frank why some things were worth fighting for, he realized that 51 years of waiting for justice was long enough. Some debts could only be paid in truth regardless of the cost to everyone involved. The time for silence was over. Margaret's kitchen smelled like fresh coffee and cinnamon rolls, the kind of warmth that reminded Frank of better times when Sarah was still alive. And Sunday mornings meant peace instead of surveillance teams and blood money. Margaret poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs, her movements careful and precise despite the arthritis that had gnarled her fingers over 7 decades of ranch work. "You look like hell, Frank," she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from him. "And that dog of yours looks worse." Ranger had collapsed beside Frank's chair, his breathing labored but steady. The German Shepherd's eyes remained alert, tracking movements beyond the windows with the hypervigilance of a soldier who knew enemies were watching. "We found him," Frank said quietly. "We found Michael." Margaret's coffee mug stopped halfway to her lips, her face draining of color as the words hit her. For 51 years, she'd lived with uncertainty, with hope that gradually withered into resignation. Now Frank was offering her the closure she'd prayed for, and the answers she'd feared to receive. "Where?" she whispered. "Buried on my property. Under the oak tree my father planted when he bought the ranch." Margaret's hands began to shake, coffee sloshing over the rim of her mug onto the checkered tablecloth. Frank reached across the table to steady her, his own hands trembling with the weight of what he had to tell her. "There's more, Margaret. Things you need to know about how he died." Frank pulled Torres's letter from his jacket pocket, the yellowed paper fragile between his fingers. He'd read it so many times during the sleepless night that he could recite it from memory. But seeing Margaret's face as she absorbed her husband's final words was like watching a woman die and be reborn simultaneously. She read in silence, her lips moving slightly as she processed each devastating revelation. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table between them like a sacred document. "So, Robert killed him," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "Your father murdered my husband." "Yes." "And you've known this for how long?" "Since yesterday evening. I called you as soon as I could." Margaret nodded slowly, studying Frank's face with the careful attention of someone evaluating whether he could be trusted with the weight of her grief. "What are you going to do about it?" "I don't know yet. There are complications." Frank told her about Patricia Hartley's call, about the surveillance team watching his property, about the offer of blood money in exchange for silence. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression growing harder with each detail. $2.3 million, she said when he finished. "That's what they think my husband's life was worth." "Margaret, You're going to take it, aren't you?" The question hit Frank like a physical blow. He'd been preparing to tell Margaret about his decision to refuse the money to fight for justice, regardless of the consequences, but her assumption that he would choose comfort over truth forced him to examine his own motivations more honestly. "I don't know," he admitted. "Part of me wants to. Sarah's medical bills, Ranger's treatment, the ranch payments. That money would solve everything. I could give you a comfortable retirement, make sure Ranger gets the best care available. And all it would cost is Michael's honor and your soul." Margaret stood and walked to the window, her gaze fixed on Frank's property where her husband's bones had lain hidden for 5 decades. "Do you know what the worst part of the last 51 years has been, Frank? Not the loneliness, not the financial struggle, not even the uncertainty about what happened to him." She turned back to face Frank, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "The worst part was the pride. The way people looked at me when they talked about my war hero husband. The respect I received as the widow of a man who died serving his country. I built my entire identity around being married to a hero, Frank. And now I find out I was married to a victim. Frank felt the weight of generational guilt settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. His father's crimes had shaped not just his own life, but Margaret's as well, creating a web of lies that had poisoned 5 decades of relationships and choices. "What if we could get them all?" Frank asked suddenly. Patricia mentioned 6 other victims, 6 other families living with the same lies we've been carrying. What if we could give them all the truth? Margaret's laugh was bitter and sharp. "You think Patricia Hartley is going to let you walk away from this deal and start calling other families? You think her security team is just going to watch while you destroy everything they've worked to protect?" As if summoned by her words, Frank's phone rang. Patricia's number appeared on the screen, and Frank could feel the weight of invisible eyes watching him through Margaret's kitchen window. "Mr. Thompson," Patricia's voice was cold and professional. "I understand you're visiting with Mrs. Torres. I hope you're explaining to her how beneficial our arrangement will be for everyone involved." "How the hell do you know where I am?" "I told you my team would be providing security for your protection. Part of that security involves monitoring your communications and movements to ensure no additional parties become involved in this sensitive situation." Frank looked around Margaret's kitchen with new paranoia. The surveillance wasn't just visual. They were listening to every word, tracking every movement, controlling every option. "Mrs. Torres," Patricia continued, her voice now addressing Margaret directly, "I know this is a difficult time for you, but I want you to understand that Mr. Thompson's cooperation in this matter will ensure your husband receives the military burial he deserves. Full honors, proper ceremony, his name inscribed on a memorial that will honor his service for generations to come." Margaret walked over and took the phone from Frank's hand. "Senator Hartley, this is Margaret Torres. I have something I'd like to say to you." "Of course, Mrs. Torres. I'm listening." "Go to hell." Margaret ended the call and handed the phone back to Frank with a smile that contained 51 years of suppressed rage. "I've been waiting my whole life to tell one of you people exactly what I think of your lies." Frank's phone immediately began ringing again, but he declined the call and turned off the device entirely. The action felt like crossing a line from which there would be no return. But it also felt like the first honest choice he'd made since discovering Torres's grave. "They'll come for us now," Frank said quietly. "Let them come," Margaret replied. "I'm 74 years old, Frank. I've got nothing left to lose except my dignity. And I'll be damned if I'm going to sell that to the people who murdered my husband." Ranger struggled to his feet, his body responding to the tension in the room with military alertness. The old dog positioned himself between Frank and the door, every instinct trained for protection despite his weakened condition. "There's something else," Frank said, pulling out a second document he'd found among his father's papers. "Your husband wasn't the only one who tried to expose what happened. There was another soldier, a medic named Thomas Chen. He sent reports to military investigators about the war crimes, but he died in a training accident 6 months after returning stateside." Margaret's face went white. "Chen? That was my maiden name. Thomas Chen was my brother." The revelation hit Frank like lightning, illuminating connections he'd never considered. Margaret hadn't just lost a husband to the conspiracy. She'd lost her brother as well. 2 members of her family murdered for trying to do the right thing, their deaths covered up and their reputations manipulated to serve the very people who'd killed them. "That's why they're so afraid," Frank realized. "You're not just Michael's widow. You're the sister of another victim, another potential witness. If you start talking about what really happened, other families might come forward. The whole conspiracy could unravel." Margaret nodded slowly, pieces of her own life's puzzle finally clicking into place. Tommy always said something didn't feel right about his unit's deployment. He came home different, scared of his own shadow. said he was going to make some calls, get some answers. 3 weeks later, he was dead in a Jeep accident that didn't make any sense. Frank's phone buzzed with a text message despite being turned off, a sign that Patricia's team had more sophisticated surveillance capabilities than he'd realized. The message was simple. You have 1 hour to reconsider. After that, we handle this differently. Margaret, Frank said urgently, we need to get out of here. Now. Patricia's people aren't going to wait much longer, and when they decide we're too dangerous to buy off, they're going to try other methods of persuasion. Where can we go? This ranch is my home, Frank. I've lived here for 40 years. We go public. Find reporters, federal investigators, people who can't be bought or intimidated. Make the story too big to suppress. Margaret looked around her kitchen one last time at the home she'd built from loneliness and determination, then back at Frank and Ranger. What about your dog? He's in no condition for running. Frank knelt beside Ranger, running his hands through the German shepherd's thick coat. The dog's eyes met his with perfect understanding. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Ranger's been through worse than this, Frank said softly. He'll do whatever it takes to complete the mission. As if in response, Ranger's tail thumped once against the floor, a soldier's acknowledgement of orders received and understood. Margaret stood and walked to a closet, returning with a small suitcase she'd apparently kept packed for emergencies. I've been ready to leave for 51 years, she said simply. I just didn't know where I was going until now. They almost made it to the highway before Patricia's security team moved to intercept them. Frank had taken back roads through the Montana countryside, Ranger panting heavily in the back seat of Margaret's old pickup truck while she clutched a manila envelope containing copies of every document they'd found. The plan was simple. Reach the FBI field office in Billings, turn over the evidence, and let federal investigators handle the rest. But Patricia Hartley hadn't survived 30 years in politics by underestimating her opponents. The roadblock appeared around a bend in the mountain highway. 3 black SUVs positioned to block both lanes of traffic. Men in tactical gear emerged from the vehicles, their movements coordinated and professional. These weren't private security contractors. They were military, current or former special operations personnel who understood how to neutralize threats efficiently and quietly. Frank, Margaret said quietly, her hands steady on the steering wheel despite the impossible situation. What do we do now? Frank assessed their options with tactical precision honed by years of combat experience. The terrain offered no escape routes, steep mountainsides on one side, a sheer drop into a canyon on the other. The pickup truck was no match for the SUVs in terms of speed or armor. Fighting was suicide against trained professionals with superior numbers and equipment. We stop, Frank said finally. But we don't give up. Margaret pulled the truck to a halt 50 yards from the roadblock. In the back seat, Ranger struggled to lift his head, his exhausted body responding to the tension with one final surge of protective instinct. The old German shepherd's eyes fixed on the approaching figures with the calculating gaze of a soldier evaluating threats. A man in his 40s approached the driver's side window, his bearing unmistakably military despite the civilian clothes. Frank recognized the type, Delta Force or Navy SEAL, the kind of operator who'd been trained to handle impossible situations with lethal efficiency. Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Torres, the man said politely. I'm Colonel Marcus Wade, acting on behalf of Senator Hartley. We need you to come with us. Are we under arrest? Margaret asked with surprising calm. No, ma'am. This is a matter of national security. We're asking for your voluntary cooperation in resolving a situation that threatens to damage important military and political relationships. Frank noticed that Wade's hand rested casually near his sidearm, the gesture subtle but unmistakable. Voluntary cooperation backed by the implicit threat of force, the kind of coercion that had kept Patricia's conspiracy hidden for 50 years. What happens if we refuse to cooperate? Frank asked. Wade's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. I hope it doesn't come to that, Mr. Thompson. You're both American citizens with rights that we respect. But you're also in possession of classified materials that could compromise ongoing national security operations. Classified? Margaret laughed bitterly. My husband's murder is classified? Your husband participated in classified operations during wartime, Mrs. Torres. The documentation you've discovered relates to operational details that remain sensitive even after 50 years. There are protocols for handling such discoveries through proper channels. Frank understood the game being played. Patricia's people weren't denying the crimes. They were reframing them as legitimate military operations that civilians couldn't properly understand or evaluate. Classify the evidence, control the narrative, ensure that any investigation happened behind closed doors where it could be managed and contained. We want to call our lawyer, Frank said. Of course. You'll have access to legal counsel once we've completed the initial security assessment. This is standard procedure for situations involving classified materials. Ranger's growl was barely audible, but Frank felt it through the seat back where the dog was pressed against the upholstery. The German Shepherd's military training was warning him of danger that human senses couldn't detect. In Afghanistan, Frank had learned to trust that instinct absolutely. Colonel Wade, Frank said carefully, I need to ask you something soldier to soldier. Do you know what really happened in Vietnam? Do you know what Michael Torres and the others were killed for exposing? Wade's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that might have been doubt or disgust. I know what I've been told, Mr. Thompson, that good soldiers made difficult decisions in an impossible situation, and that exposing those decisions now would serve no purpose except to damage the reputation of men who served their country with honor. And if what you've been told is a lie? The question hung in the mountain air like smoke from a distant fire. Wade glanced back at his team, then at the envelope in Margaret's hands, then at Frank's face with the careful attention of a man re-evaluating his assumptions. Colonel! One of Wade's subordinates called out, his voice carrying an edge of urgency. We've got movement on the ridge. Looks like media vehicles approaching from the north. Frank felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. Someone had followed them, or perhaps Margaret had made calls he didn't know about. Either way, their desperate gamble to reach authorities before being silenced had attracted exactly the kind of attention Patricia's people wanted to avoid. How many? Wade demanded. At least 3 vehicles. News vans, possibly federal law enforcement. ETA 5 minutes. Wade's expression hardened as he realized the situation was spiraling beyond his control. The protocols he'd been given probably didn't cover handling witnesses with media and federal investigators as witnesses. Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Torres, I'm going to ask you one more time to come with us voluntarily. Once those news crews arrive, this becomes a very different kind of situation. Margaret rolled down her window and handed the manila envelope to Frank, then stepped out of the truck with her hands visible and her chin raised in defiance. Colonel, I'm 74 years old, and I've been waiting 51 years for someone to hear the truth about what happened to my husband. If you're going to arrest me or kill me, you better do it right now, because those reporters are going to get the story either way. Frank climbed out on the passenger side, Ranger struggling to follow despite his weakened condition. The German Shepherd positioned himself between Frank and Wade's team, his body language unmistakably protective despite his obvious exhaustion. This is your last chance, Mr. Thompson, Wade said quietly. Senator Hartley's offer still stands. $2.3 million, comfortable retirement, and your dog gets the medical care he needs. All you have to do is walk away. Frank looked at Ranger, whose brown eyes reflected decades of unwavering loyalty despite the cost in pain and suffering. The dog had given everything for duty and honor, asking nothing in return except the chance to serve. Now, Ranger was offering Frank one final lesson about the difference between survival and integrity. "Colonel Wade," Frank said firmly, "I'm a retired master sergeant who swore an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That oath doesn't have an expiration date." The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, and Wade's team began repositioning themselves with the nervous energy of professionals who'd lost control of their mission parameters. In the distance, Frank could see news vans and federal law enforcement vehicles racing toward them with the urgency of cavalry arriving just in time to turn the tide of battle. The FBI vehicles arrived like an answer to 51 years of prayers. Agent Sarah Chen stepped out of the lead car with the purposeful stride of someone who'd been waiting for this moment as long as Margaret had been grieving. Behind her, federal marshals and state investigators spread out with tactical precision that matched Wade's team but carried the authority of legitimate law enforcement. "Colonel Wade," Agent Chen called out, her voice carrying across the mountain highway with unmistakable authority. "By order of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, you and your team are to stand down immediately and surrender any weapons or surveillance equipment." Wade's expression shifted from confident control to careful calculation. His team looked to him for orders, but the arrival of federal law enforcement had fundamentally changed the rules of engagement. Whatever protocols Patricia Hartley had given him, they didn't cover arresting FBI agents on a public highway. "Agent Chen," Wade replied formally, "my team is operating under lawful orders from the Department of Defense regarding classified materials and national security concerns." "Your team is operating under orders from Senator Patricia Hartley to intimidate and potentially harm civilian witnesses in a federal investigation," Chen shot back. "Orders that have no legal authority and constitute obstruction of justice." Frank watched the standoff with growing amazement. Agent Chen spoke as if she'd been investigating this case for months rather than responding to an emergency call. Her knowledge of the players and issues suggested preparation that went far beyond routine law enforcement response. "Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Torres," Agent Chen continued, her attention shifting to Frank and Margaret. "We've been monitoring communications related to your discovery. We're here to ensure your safety and to collect evidence related to a federal investigation into systematic war crimes and conspiracy." Margaret stepped forward, still clutching the manila envelope with its devastating contents. "Agent Chen, how long have you known about what happened to my husband?" Chen's expression softened with something that might have been sympathy or regret. "We've had fragments of information for over a decade, Mrs. Torres. Deathbed confessions from elderly veterans, financial irregularities in military contractor payments, suspicious patterns in casualty reports from Vietnam. But we never had enough evidence to build a case until your husband's remains were discovered." "A decade?" Margaret's voice cracked with the weight of realization. "You've known for a decade that my husband was murdered, and you never told me?" "We suspected, Mrs. Torres. But suspicion isn't evidence, and the people involved have spent 50 years making sure evidence stayed buried. Your dog's discovery changed everything by providing physical proof that couldn't be dismissed or covered up." Ranger had somehow found the strength to stand, his massive frame swaying but determined. The German Shepherd's eyes remained fixed on Wade's team, his military training still active despite his obvious exhaustion. Frank knelt beside his partner, offering support while staying alert to the dangerous dynamics playing out around them. "Agent Chen," Frank said carefully, "Senator Hartley offered me over $2 million to keep quiet about what we found. She claimed to represent patriotic citizens who wanted to protect military reputations." "Senator Hartley represents a conspiracy that has lasted 50 years and involves dozens of current and former officials," Chen replied. "The money comes from defense contractors, political action committees, and private citizens who've been paying to keep this story buried since 1973. Wade's radio crackled with urgent communications from his superiors, but the colonel's responses were increasingly terse and professional. Frank could see the soldier struggling with conflicting loyalties, duty to his chain of command versus respect for legitimate federal authority. "Colonel Wade," Chen addressed him directly, "I know you're a good soldier following orders, but I need you to understand what those orders are really protecting. We're not talking about legitimate military operations or classified national security information. We're talking about war crimes, multiple murders, and a conspiracy that has corrupted the highest levels of military and political leadership." Wade's composure finally cracked, revealing the moral conflict Frank had glimpsed earlier. "Agent Chen, I was told that exposing this information would damage the reputation of soldiers who served with honor under impossible circumstances." "Colonel, the soldiers who served with honor are the ones who tried to report these crimes and were murdered for their integrity. Michael Torres, Thomas Chen, and 5 others died because they believed in the oath they swore and the values they fought to defend." Margaret stepped closer to Wade, her elderly frame radiating the authority of someone who'd paid the highest price for truth. "Colonel, my husband died trying to protect innocent civilians from the men he'd served with. My brother died trying to make sure military investigators knew about war crimes being covered up by their own command structure. How does protecting their murderers honor anyone's service?" The sound of news helicopters overhead added urgency to the confrontation. Frank could see reporters setting up cameras and equipment, preparing to broadcast whatever happened next to a national audience. Patricia Hartley's worst nightmare was unfolding in real time. The story she'd spent millions to suppress was about to become front-page news. Wade made his decision with the decisive clarity of a professional soldier. "Team, stand down. Weapons secure, hands visible. We're cooperating with federal law enforcement." The tension that had stretched like a wire between the two groups suddenly snapped, replaced by the organized chaos of a legitimate law enforcement operation. Wade's team complied with federal orders while Chen's agents began collecting evidence and taking statements. "Mrs. Torres," Agent Chen said gently, "we're going to need you to come with us for a formal debriefing. Your testimony, combined with the evidence you've recovered, should be enough to bring charges against everyone involved in this conspiracy." Margaret nodded, but her attention was focused on Ranger, who had collapsed again beside Frank's leg. "Agent Chen, what about the dog? He's the one who found Michael. He's the real hero in all of this." Chen knelt beside Ranger, her professional demeanor softening as she studied the exhausted German shepherd. "Mr. Thompson, we'll make sure Ranger gets the best veterinary care available. The Bureau has resources for situations like this." Frank felt tears burning his eyes as he realized they'd actually done it. Against impossible odds, with a sick dog and an elderly widow as his only allies, he'd managed to expose a conspiracy that had lasted half a century. Michael Torres would finally get justice, and the men who'd murdered him would face consequences for their crimes. "Ranger," Frank whispered to his partner, "mission accomplished, boy. You brought them home." The old German shepherd's tail managed one final, weak thump against the asphalt, a soldier's acknowledgement of a job well done. Sometimes the greatest courage comes not from facing enemy fire, but from choosing truth over comfort, justice over security. Frank and Ranger's story reminds us that loyalty means doing what's right, even when the cost seems unbearable. In our own lives, we all face moments when we must choose between what's easy and what's right. Have you ever had to choose between personal comfort and standing up for what you believed was right? What gives you the strength to keep digging for truth when everyone around you says to let the past stay buried? Share your thoughts below. because sometimes the most important conversations happen when we're brave enough to speak the truth.